You weren't supposed to hear this." She never planned to speak it. But when her lips trembled in front of Padre Pio, something broke, the silence of hell itself. There are things that live in the corners of memory, buried under decades of rosaries, novenas, and holy water, but no sacramental could ever erase what she saw in that room the night before she almost died. And it wasn't death that terrified her, it was the voice that greeted her soul. Padre Pio looked at her with a gentleness only heaven can teach. He knew before she said a word, but he waited. Because some confessions must be born, not spoken. She sat across from him, shoulders trembling under a black veil. Her hands were cold, but her soul was burning. You know that feeling, don't you? When something inside you is screaming, but your mouth has forgotten how to open. Maybe you've walked with that same weight. A silence so heavy it bends the light in the room. A memory that refuses to be baptized. If you've ever carried something like that, share just a word in the comments. Padre Pio sees more in your silence than you think, she whispered first. It started when I was 16. And she stopped. Because even the number 16 carried the weight of 1,000 regrets. There was a man. She paused again, the way souls do when the truth becomes too holy to touch. He was a priest. I trusted him. Padre Pio didn't flinch. His eyes closed, not in judgment, but as if he was stepping into the memory with her. She told him everything, not just the sin, the silence that followed, the shame the church never saw, the voices in her head that twisted scripture into chains. She told him how she stopped praying, how she smiled at Mass, but felt like a hollow tabernacle. She told him about the night she thought God left her, and then about the morning she woke up and couldn't feel her soul anymore. I died in my sleep, she said, but no one noticed. I got up, I dressed, I worked, but something was gone. Padre Pio's breath deepened. She wasn't exaggerating. He saw the tear in her soul, how something clawed at her innocence and left a mark that bled in silence. Most people wouldn't call it hell, but he knew. The slow, invisible fire, the loss of voice, the way the Eucharist tastes like ash when the soul is hiding in fear. And then she said it, the part she'd never told anyone. One night, I heard my name. Her voice cracked, but it wasn't a voice like God's. It was colder, like it knew me better than I did. She'd been lying in bed, eyes closed, but fully awake. I was alone, but something was there, breathing, close. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey. Not sleep paralysis. No, this was different. I felt something reach into me, she said, like it was searching for something it claimed. It called me by the name I only used in sin. That was the moment Padre Pio opened his eyes again. You saw it, didn't you? He asked. She nodded. But not with my eyes, it was more like it pressed itself into my knowing. It didn't have horns. It didn't have fire. It wore her mother's face. It wore her old childhood prayer shawl. It twisted the most sacred things into mockery. It told her, "You've already chosen me," and laughed. And she believed it, until this moment, because Padre Pio, without raising his voice, whispered something that shook the walls of her soul more than any demon had. You were never theirs. Even in your silence, heaven was screaming your name. Tears didn't just fall, they poured, like the floodgates of purgatory opened for just a moment of light. She dropped to her knees, not in guilt, but because something broke free. The lie that she was too far gone. Why did it wear my mother's face? She asked, still trembling. And Padre Pio, with all the gentleness of a father who knows, said, because it wanted you to think God looked like pain, so you'd never come back. Let that settle in your soul. How many times has the enemy dressed your memories in sacred robes just to keep you away from healing? Comment if you've ever mistaken silence for God's rejection, or if a holy image once haunted you instead of healed you. You're not alone. And you were never too far. As the confession unraveled, something ancient returned. A warmth, a pulse in her chest, a memory from when she was 7, kneeling alone in church, whispering secrets to the tabernacle because she believed he heard. That version of her, the girl before shame, was still waiting. Padre Pio saw it. He pointed not to the past, not to the sin, not to the silence, but to the promise. "She's still there," he said, "and she's never stopped praying for you." That's the part no one tells you. Sometimes it's your younger self interceding for the woman you became. Sometimes your purest prayer isn't new, it's ancient, buried, still breathing. And in that moment she believed again, not in the church, not in rituals, but in the truth that heaven never left. You weren't supposed to hear this. That's why you must, because there is someone watching this right now who still thinks the silence in their room is proof of abandonment. Someone who once saw something wearing a holy mask and never recovered. Someone who, like her, thought their last confession was already made, but it wasn't. The last one is the one where you return, and she did. The air around them didn't move. It was as if time had stopped just long enough for her soul to breathe again. She wasn't the same woman who had entered that room. Something had cracked. But it wasn't just pain that leaked out. It was memory. And memory, when touched by grace, turns into light. She sat back, eyes swollen but calm. "I didn't think I would ever be able to say those things," she whispered. "Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't think heaven would listen." Padre Pio didn't speak, but his gaze held her as if to say, heaven had been listening all along. There are certain kinds of silence that feel like walls. Years of rosaries said without hope, candles lit with hands that tremble from shame more than faith. She had lived that, and worse, she had convinced herself that it was holy. "When I walked into churches, I always sat in the last pew," she said, "not out of humility, out of fear. I thought the closer I got to the altar, the louder my past would echo." She remembered once, during Lent, kneeling as everyone else rose for communion. The woman next to her looked down, confused, but she stayed kneeling, frozen. "I thought if the host touched my tongue, it would burn." Padre Pio's brow softened. There was something sacred about letting a wound speak for itself. He knew that too many souls were taught to dress their pain in pious phrases. But she didn't need a lesson. She needed to remember who she was before shame became her religion. She went on, "The night after, when I first saw it, that presence, I stopped praying altogether, not because I didn't believe in God, but because I thought He left me in that room on purpose." There was a pause, the kind that's louder than screaming. "I thought if God really saw everything, then He saw what I let happen, what I didn't stop, what I didn't confess." The enemy didn't need to destroy her faith, he only needed to poison her memory of God, and it worked. For decades she served in silence, volunteered, lit candles for other people's intentions, never her own. She told herself that heaven was for the clean. She would be the one to wait outside the gate, quietly, hoping someone remembered her, until the day something cracked in the middle of Mass. They were singing Lamb of God, she said, and I suddenly couldn't breathe, not because of my lungs, but because the words made me feel accused. She ran to the restroom, locked the door, and sobbed like a child. Not from guilt, from the weight of feeling invisible even in the presence of angels. And that night she dreamed of Padre Pio, not the man in front of her now, but a figure in shadow, sitting in an old confessional carved in wood that pulsed like it was alive. She didn't speak in the dream, but he nodded as if he heard every word her soul never dared to form. When she woke up, she knew she had to find him, even if she didn't believe she'd be received, even if she didn't believe it would work. But now, sitting before him, something in her had shifted. The shame hadn't disappeared, but it was no longer choking her. It had become still, and in the stillness something else could grow. "You're not here to confess," Padre Pio finally said. "You're here to return." She blinked. "Return to what?" "To the voice that first called you." Her breath caught. Not because she remembered that voice, but because she suddenly realized it had never stopped calling. When she was 9, she used to sit in the garden behind her grandmother's house and talk to God as if he were hidden in the wind. She had asked him questions no adult dared to answer. Where do souls go when they forget they're holy? Do tears count as prayer? Can a child's whisper reach heaven faster than a priest's chant? And once after asking, "Will I always belong to you?" she felt a gust of air warm her cheek. Though it was winter, she had forgotten that moment. Forgotten it so completely that when darkness dressed itself as her past, she believed it had the final word. But now she remembered. "Shame told me God had walked out of the room," she said. "But it was me who locked the door." Padre Pio nodded, "and the key was never on his side." There is something holy about being seen and not condemned, about being broken and not dismissed. The world teaches you to hide what hurts. Heaven waits until you're ready to let it breathe. She looked down at her hands again. This time they weren't shaking. "What happens now?" she asked. "You asked to remember. That's it? That's everything." Because confession is not just about recounting sin. It is the sacred act of recalling the truth beneath the shame. It is a return to the name heaven never stopped using. And some souls like hers need to speak their darkness aloud, not to relive it, but to let the light enter through the cracks. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in decades she whispered the name she used when she was 9. Not the one the priest had used, not the one she carried in guilt, the one she offered to the wind and trusted heaven to remember. Padre Pio didn't ask her to repeat it. He only said, "She's been waiting for you," and the silence in the room wasn't empty anymore. It was full of welcome. There was something about that silence. It didn't just settle, it held her. As if the room itself remembered her before she ever forgot herself. And for the first time in decades, she didn't feel like an intruder in a holy place. She felt like a daughter returning home through a door she didn't know was still open. Padre Pio remained quiet, but his presence was louder than any homily. He wasn't just listening, he was bearing witness. And she understood then, some wounds don't need to be explained, they just need to be seen by someone who won't look away. "I always thought I had to clean myself before God could look at me again," she said softly. "But maybe I was the one refusing to look." Her voice trembled not from fear, but from recognition. As if the words she finally spoke had been waiting for her, buried under years of silence disguised as obedience. "I kept waiting for him to punish me," she continued, "because I thought if he didn't, I'd never stop punishing myself. And that's when it happened. Not a miracle that shook the walls. No vision, no levitation, no divine thunder. Just a presence, gentle, warm, so soft it could have been mistaken for breath. But it wasn't coming from her lungs. It was something else, something older. She felt it wrap around her, not touch, not even light, just awareness, like being recognized by the only one who truly remembered the moment her soul was knit together in the secret place. And for the first time she didn't flinch, because she knew it wasn't wrath. It was mercy. Not the kind they preach from pulpits, the kind that crawls into locked rooms and waits until your trembling becomes stillness. "I'm afraid to hope," she whispered. Padre Pio looked straight into her. "That's because the last time you hoped, no one came." It wasn't an accusation. It was an unlocking. She had stopped praying for herself because every time she had asked God for help, she imagined him watching and doing nothing. She'd turned her suffering into proof of abandonment. But in truth, she had been praying to a silence her trauma invented. "Hope didn't betray you," he said. "False images of God did." And just like that, another wall inside her cracked. Not collapsed, cracked. Enough for air to move. Enough for something holy to whisper in. She suddenly remembered a night from her 20s, alone in her kitchen, crying without sound, palms pressed against the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. She remembered asking, "If you're real, why didn't you protect me?" And tonight, all these years later, she finally heard the answer, not with her ears, but with her whole being. "Because I never left you unguarded. I wept behind you when you couldn't turn around." Her knees went weak. She didn't fall. She folded. As if the weight that kept her upright had suddenly been lifted. And in that folding, she wasn't breaking. She was becoming small enough to be held. Padre Pio didn't move. But something in the room did. The kind of shift that doesn't disturb the furniture, but rearranges eternity inside one person's chest. She wanted to stay there forever. But something in her stirred. "I need to ask you something," she said, eyes still closed. "That night when I saw it, when I left my body, was that hell?" "No," he answered gently. "That was the lie hell told you." Her throat clenched, but it felt so real. It was But reality and truth aren't always the same. She didn't understand, and he didn't explain. Because some answers are given not to minds, but to memory. Then what was it? She asked again. That corridor, that voice. He waited, not out of hesitation but reverence, as if to honor the weight of the question. It was the shape of what you believed you deserved. She froze. The shape. She had worn the shame so long it had formed its own cathedral inside her. A dark place with pews carved by guilt, stained glass made from broken images of God, and an altar where her soul sacrificed its own voice. And the enemy had never needed to build hell. She built it for him. Out of every unanswered prayer, every moment she stayed silent, every time she convinced herself that holiness was for people who didn't bleed like her, Padre Pio's voice dropped to a whisper. That place was never heaven's design. It was what formed when your heart believed a lie long enough to build a liturgy around it. A single tear slid down her cheek. It wasn't from pain. It was from relief. Relief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't condemned after all. And that voice that greeted her on the other side wasn't an eternal sentence. It was the final echo of a lie being exposed. What happens to people who believe the lie their whole lives? She asked. They suffer, quietly, faithful to shame instead of grace. And what about me? You heard yourself in time. The simplicity of it stunned her. There was no spiritual formula, no penance list, no divine arithmetic. Just this. You heard yourself in time. She thought of the women she'd prayed beside over the years. How many of them carried similar ghosts behind their veils? How many sat in pews like hers, eyes forward, hearts backward, haunted by a version of God that never loved them? And she wondered, how many more were still stuck in that corridor, still answering to a name they never chose, still mistaking silence for rejection, still kneeling before altars inside themselves that only shame had built? Padre Pio saw her thinking. He didn't interrupt. He simply let the weight of remembrance fall exactly where it needed to fall. And then he said what broke her open. You're not the only one who is waiting for this moment. She looked up. Heaven waits too. And suddenly she wasn't afraid to hope anymore. She wasn't afraid to hope anymore. But she didn't know what to do with it. Hope, when it's been buried too long, doesn't rise like light. It comes up trembling, confused, like a child waking from a nightmare and not knowing if it's safe to speak. I want to believe, she said, but I don't know how to trust the light. It feels too soft, too far. Padre Pio didn't answer with words. He leaned slightly forward, as if to make sure his voice would meet her where she was. That's because you've spent too long letting pain finish God's sentences. She blinked. Her body remained still, but something inside her recoiled and then leaned in. Because he was right. Every time she heard the voice of mercy, she'd added a warning to it. Every time she felt the warmth of divine attention, she braced for abandonment. It wasn't theology that broke her, it was tone. The cruel tone of voices that once claimed to speak for God. I've read scripture, she said. I know the words, but when I read about love, I always imagined him loving everyone else. He nodded. Because you memorized verses through the lens of your wound. That sentence didn't comfort her, it freed her, and for the first time she let herself admit something she never dared to whisper, even in prayer. I thought suffering made me holy. He nodded again, slower this time. Suffering can soften the soul, yes, but shame doesn't sanctify, it silences. She had confused silence for sanctity, hiding for reverence, emptiness for devotion, and she wore them all like vestments, believing the more she disappeared, the closer to God she would be. But heaven had never asked her to disappear. Heaven had waited for her to return to herself, to her name, to her soul. She inhaled, long and slow, and in that breath she tasted something she hadn't known she'd forgotten. The scent of the fig trees from her grandmother's backyard, the echo of her voice reciting a Hail Mary barefoot in the grass, the feeling of sunlight warming her shoulders during First Communion rehearsal. All memories she'd buried, not because they were painful, but because they were too pure to touch once shame arrived, and now they returned, not as nostalgia, as evidence, proof that heaven had spoken to her long before pain ever opened its mouth. Those moments, she whispered, were real. Yes, Padre Pio said, and they still are. She almost asked how. But she didn't need to. She could feel it now. that time doesn't steal what heaven seals, that no sin, no silence, no night of darkness had the authority to erase what God Himself had written into her. She had spent years asking where God was when it happened, but the better question had been hiding in plain sight. Where had she gone when she stopped calling herself His? Why did I let it change me? She asked, voice trembling. Why didn't I fight harder? Padre Pio's eyes deepened. Because no one taught you the difference between surrender and collapse. She had collapsed under a weight that wasn't hers. She had surrendered not to grace, but to guilt. And the longer she stayed collapsed, the more familiar it felt, until she called it humility. But this remembering, this naming, this sacred confrontation with her soul, this was surrender, not to despair, not to pain, to truth. And truth, when it's finally welcomed, doesn't shout, it embraces. Her hands rested gently in her lap now. The trembling had stopped. I want to go back, she said suddenly. To when? To the room, the corridor, where I saw it. I want to see it again, but not alone. Padre Pio's head tilted. Why? Because I want to walk through it without fear this time. I want to look at the thing that lied to me and tell it. You were wrong. That was the moment the light in the room shifted. Not brighter, clearer. She didn't see a vision, but she felt as if a veil had lifted, not from heaven, but from her perception. As if the soul, now unchained, had stood up inside her for the first time in years, and somewhere inside, in that unseen chamber between memory and spirit, she returned to the corridor. But it wasn't dark anymore. The walls were still endless, but they no longer closed in. The floor beneath her wasn't smoke or shadow. It was solid now, grounded, and in the distance she saw the outline of the thing that once called her name in mockery. Only this time she didn't flinch. She walked slowly toward it, each step no longer fueled by dread, but by a holy stillness. And when she stood in front of it, she didn't speak in rage. She whispered, "You lied to me in the voice of God, but I know better now. You wore the face of sacred things to keep me from returning, but I'm already home." And with that it vanished, not in a scream, not in a fight. It simply faded, because it no longer had anything to cling to, and in its place, stillness. She opened her eyes. She was back in the room. Padre Pio hadn't moved, but he was looking at her with the kind of expression only saints can carry. Not pride, not pity, recognition. "You walked through it," he said. She nodded. "I didn't win. I just stopped agreeing. That's how chains fall," he said, "not with noise, with truth." And she smiled. Not a smile for others, not a performance. A private, quiet smile between her and the one who never stopped watching the door she thought she had closed for good. She didn't ask what came next, because this wasn't a new chapter. It was the first time she'd re-entered her own story, and this time she wouldn't disappear inside it. She wouldn't disappear again. Not into ritual, not into silence, not even into service, because now she knew. There's a kind of disappearing that looks holy on the outside but leaves the soul starved behind stained glass. Padre Pio didn't praise her. Saints don't celebrate victories like trophies. They recognize turning points as sacred ground. And in his stillness, she felt it, like he was standing back to let heaven draw nearer. "You stopped agreeing," he had said. But what she hadn't yet said out loud was that for most of her life, she did agree with every voice that diminished her, every silence that became her confession, every altar she knelt before where God's face felt absent. Now for the first time she didn't just disbelieve the lie, she withdrew her consent. That shift, so quiet, so simple, changed everything, because the soul doesn't need deliverance from darkness nearly as much as it needs the permission to believe it was never meant to live there. She stood, not abruptly, not to leave, but as if some part of her had finally remembered it had legs. Her hands no longer clutched her skirt, her back no longer bent beneath shame's invisible hand. And Padre Pio just watched, calm and unmoving, like someone who'd seen this resurrection before. "I want to speak to him again," she said. "To who?" "To God. Not the voice I heard in that room, not the one I invented in my fear. I want to speak to the real one again." She stepped closer to the crucifix in the corner of the room. not to weep beneath it, not to beg, but simply to speak, like she once did when she was 9, when she still believed he listened without conditions. She looked up. The voice was raw, but it didn't shake. "If you're still here," she said, "I want you to know, I'm not afraid of being loved anymore." The words didn't echo, they didn't need to, because this wasn't a prayer asking for anything. It was a return of voice. Padre Pio stood too now, slowly. He didn't bless her, he didn't dismiss her. He simply said, "Then love will begin its return to you in ways you won't recognize at first. And when it does, don't apologize for receiving it." She turned to him. "But what if others don't understand? What if they say I'm selfish, that I should carry my cross quietly?" He smiled gently. The cross was never a command to disappear. It was an invitation to walk in truth. Even if it wounds, even if it exposes, even if it costs you the respect of those who only loved your silence. Her eyes watered, not because it hurt, but because it finally made sense. She had learned to stay small to avoid rejection. She had stayed quiet to be acceptable. But now, she would rather be misunderstood for healing than be praised for hiding. "And the darkness," she asked, "the one that wore my mother's face, that called me by my sin, what if it returns?" Padre Pio didn't flinch. "It will," he said it as if he were naming a season. Not a threat, just a truth. But you won't recognize it the same. You won't bow, you won't agree. And that's what breaks it. No holy water, no fire, no Latin incantation. Just one soul standing still, refusing to forget who she truly is. "And if I fall again?" she asked, quieter now. "Then fall into him," Padre Pio said, "not into shame, not into hiding. Let even your collapse become communion." She didn't speak after that, because nothing else needed to be said. Not every revelation is loud. Some arrive like the sunrise, gradual, faithful, undeniable. She looked around the room one last time. Everything was the same, and yet, nothing was. The chair where she sat was still creased by her trembling. The crucifix hadn't moved. The scent of roses had long faded. But she had returned, not just to the church, not to doctrine, but to the sacred center where the Father was always waiting, not with punishment, but with recognition. She stepped outside the confessional chamber, not to be seen, but to finally see the sky, the stones, the steps beneath her feet, all witnesses to her remembering. In the courtyard, a group of pilgrims passed by without noticing her. One of them was weeping quietly, another clutched a worn prayer card of Padre Pio like it was air. And she felt no urgency to correct them, to share her story, to speak anything, because some victories don't need to be shared. They need to be lived into. Day by day, word by word, choice by quiet choice, she walked to the chapel door. Her hand hovered for a second before touching it. Not out of hesitation, out of reverence. For the first time in decades, the door wasn't a barrier. It was a gate. She pushed it open slowly, and when she entered the church, she didn't head to the back pew. She walked straight down the aisle, not rushed, not ashamed. She stopped in the front row where she used to fear being seen, and she knelt, not to disappear but to be known, to be received. No visions came, no thunder shook the dome, but she could feel it, a presence steady and warm, and for the first time the silence wasn't empty. It was full of him. She knelt in the front pew, and for once the silence didn't accuse her. It clothed her. She wasn't trying to prove she belonged. She wasn't performing for the stained glass or the eyes of angels she used to imagine watching in disappointment. She was simply there, still, whole, and held. The host was locked in the tabernacle, but he was already in the room. She could feel it, not as power, not as fear, as closeness. The kind a child feels when they know someone waited up for them. All this time, he had stayed. She was the one who'd gone missing. For years, she had confused holiness with hiding. She mistook disappearing for devotion. But the Father never rejoiced in her silence. He was the one who wept every time she called herself unworthy, and wore shame as if it was sacred. She looked up at the crucifix, not out of guilt, not to confess, just to see the face she had avoided for too long. And it didn't look angry. It looked like it had always known this moment would come, that before she entered that corridor, before she spoke the name she never dared admit, before she surrendered her voice, There was already a place set for her here, in this church, in this silence, in this breath. A breeze moved gently across the chapel floor. It wasn't wind. It was memory returning. The same presence that once wrapped around her in the convent room now leaned close, not beside her, but within. Not shouting, not even whispering, just being. And she understood. This was what they meant when they said Emmanuel. Not a title, a nearness. And in that stillness the last fear broke. She remembered the name, the real one. Not the name she used in sin, not the one they spoke behind her back, not the one she gave herself in shame. The name spoken once, only once, when her soul was formed in heaven's quiet workshop. The name only God and she would ever fully know. And she spoke it not aloud, but inside. The whisper of it sent a shiver through her spirit. Not from fear, but recognition. A homecoming sound. The name that hell could never steal. The name that darkness had no permission to use. The name that had waited beneath every layer of grief, beneath guilt, beneath the silence, patient and alive. When she spoke it inwardly, she felt something shift, not just in her, but in the space around her. It was like heaven leaned in closer, not to applaud her strength, but to celebrate her remembrance. Because this is what hell fears most, not your discipline, not your obedience, not your guilt. Hell fears your remembrance. When a soul remembers its real name, everything built on the lie begins to unravel. And in that moment she wasn't just forgiven, she wasn't just healed, she was returned, not to a doctrine, not to an altar, but to the center of the one who never left. Behind her the doors of the church creaked gently as another woman entered. Different life, different story, but carrying the same silence, the same weight, the same unanswered question behind her eyes. They didn't speak, they didn't have to, because something had changed in the air. One woman had remembered, and remembrance is contagious. She stood slowly from her knees, not in rebellion, not in triumph, in peace. Her spine no longer bent, her eyes no longer darted, and she didn't glance back toward the tabernacle because she knew he was already walking with her now, not ahead, in her. She stepped out into the sunlight, and for the first time in decades, it didn't feel too bright. It felt like recognition, like the earth itself knew she had returned to her place in it. And there, on the stone path leading away from the chapel, she didn't make a vow, she didn't recite a prayer. She simply said, from the bottom of her soul, I'm not going back. Not to the corridor, not to the silence, not to the lie that dressed itself in holy robes, because now she carried something with her that hell couldn't counterfeit, her name. And names don't echo, they resound. She passed by a young man lighting a candle. His hands shook, his eyes wouldn't lift. She didn't interrupt. But as she passed him, the scent of roses followed. Not strong, just enough. Enough for him to stop, breathe in, and wonder why he suddenly felt known. Sometimes the ones who've been most lost carry the clearest scent of home, and that's when she knew it wasn't just about her anymore. She had returned so others could remember too. Someone watching this has felt what she felt. The echo of a voice you didn't choose calling your soul in the dark. The weight of kneeling while heaven seems silent. The fear that maybe, just maybe, you were never fully welcome. But what if you were never unwelcome? What if the rejection was never real? What if the silence was a place prepared for your remembrance, not your exile? You don't need to tell your story out loud. You don't need to explain everything you saw in the dark. But maybe, just maybe, it's time to speak your real name again. The one heaven whispered over you before you forgot. And when you do, everything that ever lied to you will lose its right to speak. Not because you won a battle, but because you finally stopped agreeing to be less than known. She told Padre Pio what she saw, but more than that, she remembered what heaven had never forgotten.